Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews. We've been looking for several sessions now at Hebrews chapter 11, the great chapter on faith. The author of Hebrews has been taking us through the roll call of faith, giving illustration after illustration of the great men and women of God who lived by utter faith and trust in God. Now, as we begin verse 32, we're beginning sort of the last paragraph or the last section of the chapter. Now, so far, as we've talked about these great heroes of faith, we've talked about Abel and Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. Talked about the Passover and the Exodus. We've talked about the fall of Jericho and Rahab. What a great example they all provide for us of living by faith. And now, as the author begins the last part of this chapter, notice what he says in verse 32. What more shall I say? Isn't that interesting? What more shall I say? I've told you all these examples of faith, and there's so many more I could list. I don't have time, he says, to tell you about Gideon or Barak or Samson or Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets. He mentions several here. Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah are all found in the book of Judges. They're not the only judges mentioned, but they're four of the prominent judges mentioned in that book. So during the time of the judges, after the conquest and before the first king, the judges ruled. From time to time, God would raise up leaders to deliver his people from foreign oppression and to lead them back to God. And he mentions four of those. We know their names well. You can read their stories, obviously, in the book of Judges. He also mentions David the king. Now, David was not the first king of Israel. Saul was. But you remember, because of Saul's rebellion, he was replaced by David. And David became the ideal king. David was the man after God's own heart. And even though David was not perfect, far from it, you know the story of David well, yet he had a heart for God. And God promised that a son of David would always be king over the Jewish people. Of course, that was ultimately fulfilled with the coming of the Messiah, Jesus, who was in the line of David and who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So certainly he mentions David as one of those great heroes of the faith. He also mentions Samuel. Now, Samuel stood between the time of the judges and the time of the kings. In a sense, Samuel was the last of the judges, and he prepared the way for the coming of the monarchy in Israel. You remember, it was Samuel who first anointed Saul, and also it was Samuel who anointed David. So Samuel was a great transitional figure, moving from the time of the judges to the time of the kings of Israel. And then he just mentions in general the prophets. He doesn't call any of the prophets by name. He just mentions the prophets. Now, the prophets were those spokesmen for God. From time to time, God would raise up someone to speak his word to the people of Israel. Thus says the Lord. That was the hallmark of the prophet. They had been in the counsel of God. God had given them his word, and they would come to Israel and say, thus says the Lord. You know, when we think of the prophets, our mind goes to Elijah, that great prophet who stood against Ahab and Jezebel and called the people back to God. And we think of his young mentor, Elisha, who followed Elijah, did great things for the Lord. And then we think of all the prophets who had books that bear their name, prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And then the 12, we call the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, and on it goes. All these great men of God who God raised up to speak his word to the people. So again, this great roll call of faith, the author of Hebrews says, I can't mention everybody, so I'll just mention a few in passing. I'll mention all the prophets, but all throughout history, God has called men and women to believe in him, to trust in him, and to live by faith. And so he calls us. You know, the reason he's given all these illustrations is because this is the way we ought to live as well. We are to live as people of faith. We are to live by utter trust in God, so that one day our name could be added to that great roll call of people who lived by faith. It's not about anything based within ourselves, our own ingenuity, our own resources. It's all about believing in, trusting in, being faithful to, being loyal to God through faith in Jesus. So he says, what more shall I say? There's so many more I could mention. And then in verse 33, he's just going to begin to give a lot of examples of how they live by faith and what they accomplished. We'll look at that tomorrow. This last section of the book of Hebrews, where he kind of just lists all the wonderful things these great men and women of faith did, all by faith. So join us tomorrow as we kind of wrap up Hebrews chapter 11 in our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews.